Yes,
I don't know what to say about
well,
it.
that's all right. Just whatever you know. In other words, we don't.
Well, soon after we came here, my father put a sawmill down on Rock Creek, down, not.
All right, go ahead.
From that sawmill, the scraps were used for fuel. We used it as wood, and I think we used wood and coal almost all together until they struck oil here, and then we could get gas. I don't know just when they first, seemed to me in 1906 or 7 was when they first got gas in here, and Mr. Smith, I don't know what his name was now other than Smith, put in on gas plant and piped gas around over town. I remember we lived out about 8 or 9 blocks from east of Maine, but we had gas. I think we had the first gas and the first electricity in our house that was in town. I don't know how it happened, but it was just a flat rate. You just paid so much for your gas, and after gas was pretty well piped over town, I don't think hardly anyone used anything but gas. The water was from wells. Everyone had wells and cisterns. Many people used cisterns. We did. And then the electricity came in, I believe, in 1903 was when we had our first electricity. And the electric company gave away irons and would put a wire into your house if you'd buy an iron from them. The idea was they'd give you an electric iron if they knew then you'd want more electricity, you know. But that was the bait, and it was a big help. I didn't tell you about the railroads building. That's an interesting thing that you wanted to know about, and I forgot. The Frisco built west in they started in 1897, I believe, 6 or 7. And all the eastern papers advertised the railroad was going to be built from Sapulpa to Oklahoma City, and they needed laborers. And people piled in here, just train loads of people came in to work on that railroad. And they didn't have work for anything like that many people. And it was in the winter, and the people were suffering. They didn't have money to go back home, and they couldn't get jobs. And my father said, if any of you men who want to work, now he says, we can't just feed you for nothing, but if you want to work, we'll try to give you work to do, and you can earn enough to eat and all. And he had this little sawmill down there, and they cut a lot of lumber down there, and he started a brick plant, and I think it's the Sapulpa brick plant now. Some man came to him and he said, Menifee, that hill over here back of the plant, back of where he was camped, is good brick clay. And he says, if you'll back us, well, we'll try to start a brick plant down there. My father says, all right. And so he worked for my father for a long while on that. And there are a good many houses in Sapulpa that were built with those brick. They were sun-dried brick, not vitrified. But in our own home, we used his brick and then put vitrified brick on the outside. You remember where?
Might be interested that brick company still running.
Yes,
It's the Sapulpa Brick Company.
Yes, I don't believe I clipped an item out of the paper the other day, and thought I'd call Mr. Hermes and ask him if he knew where that started. I didn't think from what he had told the reporter that he knew the full story of it. But and Virginia's been trying to get me one of those bricks, but we haven't been able to. They tore down our home. Oh, it's been sold several times, but it was torn down in the last 2 years. And Virginia's been trying to get me one of those bricks, but I can't find it. That road was built on, they eventually built that road on west, and I think it's Frisco out through the western part of the United States.
This is the railroad.
The Frisco Railroad. And then soon after they built west, they built south. The Sherman branch of the Frisco went south. And I know we had built a house up, this brick house I was talking about. We built out there so we get away from the whistling of the trains. And before we could get our house built, they built the road south, and we were right close to that. So we always had the trains under our nose.
Anything else either of y'all think about? Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ms. Warren Darner from Sapulpa, Oklahoma. This is Pendleton Woods recording for the Oklahoma Living Legends. We're visiting in Sapulpa on December 4th, 1969 with Mr. Guy Hereford, who came to Sapulpa in 1895, who has lived here most of the time since coming to Sapulpa, and who has been a builder, a carpenter, a cabinet maker, and involved in other types of building. Mr. Hereford, I wonder to begin with if you would tell us a little about your own birth background, where you are from, and when you came to Oklahoma.
Well, I was born in Illinois at a little town called Secor, Illinois, in Woodford County. That's between Chicago and Peoria. And there we left as I was about 6 years old and went to Kansas. And we went to Wichita, Kansas, then we landed Kingwood, and finally we went out to Greensburg, Kansas. That's about 20 miles east of Dodge City. And we lived there until I was 16 years old. Then we moved to St. Louis, and from St. Louis, stayed there about a year, and then I finally went back to Kansas and came down to Ponca City, Oklahoma. And from there, in 1895, I rode from a horse from Ponca City down to Sapulpa.
How long were you? How old are you, Mr. Hereford?
I was 93, 17th of last month.
17th of November 1969. You were 93. Let's start with Ponca City. Could you tell us a little about Ponca City when you came here?
Well, Ponca City, when I came there, was just a town of just shacks and everything of the kind, you know. There wasn't very much of anything there in 95. Well, I see that was about 94, long about 94 when I got to Ponca City. I stayed around there, worked on a farm a while, but Ponca City had, there were some saloons, and there just wasn't very much of anything there at all at that time when I come there. I worked on that farm, but, I got $8 a month down there. And I worked there about almost a year from there. Well, I come down to Oklahoma, down into this part of Oklahoma, in the Indian Territory. And from there on, Well, you just have to tell me what you want to know.
All right. Well, let's still staying with Ponca City for a little while. Why don't you tell us about the streets and roads and such in Ponca City? You do not. All right. Well, we'll move then on to Sapulpa. We're interested, of course, in all of Oklahoma. Could you describe the city of Sapulpa or the town of Sapulpa or village when you arrived here in 1895?
Well, there was on the other side of the railroad track, Main Street, it's called Main Street now, the North Main Street, there was H.C. Hall and Company had a store. Just a kind of a general store. There wasn't very much to it, but then there was a building right beside of it. It was vacant at that time when I come, but I don't know what there ever was in that. On this side of the track, there was Menifee in France had a store. John Egan had the post office. And Smith had the hotel. And there was a blacksmith shop and a livery stable. And that was just about Sapulpa except a few little houses.
When you came here, what did you do? What did you first do when you arrived here in the way of work?
When I first came to Sapulpa, we went down and took a lease, a 10-year lease on a piece of land south and west of Mounds. An uncle of mine, and we lived there. Then I lived there until I got married in 1900. And then I moved to Sapulpa. And I practically lived here ever since.
You've been involved in construction during most of your period here. Why don't you tell us a little about speaking of the construction of homes, what you were dealing with in the way of tools and in the way of materials at that time?
Well, of course, we had our own hand tools. We had to do everything by hand, make all of our window frames, and had the foundations were made out of the sandstone of this vicinity here. Had no concrete or anything of that kind. Everything was plastered. We had no other way of finishing the house on the inside only. We would line it and then cover it with canvas and paper over that canvas. That was about the way the houses were constructed here. Some of it was native lumber, but the most of it was shipped in here after 1900. They had some lumber yards here, and we could get to, and nearly all yellow pine. That's about the construction of the houses, about all I can tell you about them. Oh, I built quite a good many of them. I built that house right over there.
What about the tools that you worked with at that time?
We had hand tools. I was, after I got to know a little about the carpenter business, I was put on the bench, what they called a benchman. And I'd have to make all of these and had the planes, I had a set of planes, and I had a plow plane to plow out from my window frames. And we had the shingle with shingling hatchets. We had nothing but wood shingles in them days, except on the business houses. They put flat roofs on it, put different kind of roofs on them to stop the water from coming in. Well, that's the tools outside of that was just just a hammer and a hatchet and hand axe. That's about all I had.
How about supply? Your obtaining of materials and supplies for our building?
Well, outside of the lumber, there wasn't very much of anything that we needed. We got the stone right here, and the sand. Of course, the sand had to come from Tulsa, where we got up in the Arkansas River, where we got the better sand there. We didn't have any sand here. We had to get that, and we used lime. Didn't have any cement in them days. You couldn't plaster with. We had nothing else to plaster with, only lime and sand. We didn't have any cement of any kind, and that's the way we finished the houses.
Did they have lime companies or sand companies, or did you have to actually go out into the sand beds and get this material?
Well, we had men to haul it in here with wagons. They brought it in the teams and wagons. And they would go up there and get it, and then we'd have to screen it to take the heavy sand out, you know. And that's the way we got our sand. Well, the lime that was shipped in here, we had to slack our lime. We didn't have the slack lime like they have now. It'd come in big chunks, and we'd put it there, then put water on it, slack it, and then use that what they call a putty, and use that putty to mix in with the sand to make a plastering, and use that to make the foundations with too.
Of the houses that you built, can you recall what is the oldest house that may still be standing that you built?
Well, I just can't think of the oldest one now, but I built a house for my father on West Dewey. That was built in, let's see, that was built in about 1902. That's the one that I built there. But I built several houses, but I just don't recall just where they were at. I built lots of houses here.
You built your own house, that's correct?
I built the house I'm living in now in 1909. Yes, I built that for my father in 1909. That's a two-story house, and it's got about 12 rooms in it. And now I'm using that. If you want anything like that, I'm using that. There are 2 apartments below and an apartment above.
Are you, were your original houses, were you using log, and when did, if this is so, when did you begin to move from the log to the finished lumber?
Well, we never built any log houses here. We never did build any log houses here. I didn't. There were log houses here. I built one on a farm, but then never did in Sapulpa. I never built a log house in Sapulpa.
I understand that they had brick plant here, was built. We had talked about that with an earlier interview. Could you tell us a little about the brick plant and whether you did any brick work?
Well, the brick plant, we had one that they just mixed it by hand. That was on West Dewey. That was on let's see, that is the 200 block on West Dewey on the hill up there. They mixed that by hand, and then they didn't burn it like they do now. They had just a little, took it made it out of mud. They didn't have the finished brick. It was soft brick. It wasn't never much account. And there was one building built here with it that I can remember. They've tore it down now. That was where the Oklahoma Tire and Supply is now. That was built on the street. And I think Mr. Menifee's home that lives over there, I think that was built out of the brick, but I'm not too sure about that.
You built a number of commercial buildings, is this correct?
Well, I worked on them. Yes, on West Main Street. There's a string I was working at that time. I was younger, wasn't contracting into then. I was working for a man named Blackwelder. And I made all of the fronts out of cypress. Heavy cypress, and then I put the plate glass in them out of cypress.
You were involved in the old federal courthouse building, is this correct?
Yeah, my father built the old federal courthouse. That is, he had it built for the federal and had it rented to the federal when he built it. And they also called that the Lucille Opera House. Now that had an opera house above, a big courtroom above, and then they had a stage built back in there for an opera house. And they had quite a good many little opera people come here. Then the courtrooms were all downstairs.
Can you tell us about any of the operas that were here?
Well, the only ones I can really remember was the Bessie Farrell Company, The Taming of the Shrew. Now, that's the only one I can remember.
When was it here, do you remember?
Well, that must have been about, after that was built, that was about 1904 or 5 or somewhere along in there.
Could you tell us a little about the construction of the federal courthouse? What was involved in that, and maybe describe the building a little bit?
Well, the foundation was made out of sandstone, and the rest of it was brick. It was made in this brickyard out of this plant down here, or they brought the brick in, I don't know which, but I think it's made out of, not of the old plant that I showed a while ago, but in the new one that they got now. That is, it was new then, it's an old one now, of course. And that was built out of brick. It was, I think, about a 14-foot story, the first story, and the next one is about 12 or 14 feet. It's a pretty high building. The walls are built pretty heavy, and a heavy construction. Then the roof was built with a comb roof on it, and they finally took that down. And when they made apartments out of it, then they took that down and put a flat roof on it, and then put the roof on and out of tar and tar paper and gravel and stuff like they use on.
What to you was the most memorable occasion, the thing you remember most that happened before 1900 here in Sapulpa?
Well, there just wasn't very much of anything that happened here in Sapulpa. Before that amounted to anything. There wasn't much Sapulpa here. But before Sapulpa, this was the end of the Frisco, and in 1906, I believe it, or 1896, I mean, the road went west and went to Oklahoma City. Now I don't know how much farther. Then a year or two after that, they built what they call the Red River Division that goes south. That I worked on that. That is, I had a survey, and the stationary engineers come in there and wanted somebody to haul them, and they hired me to haul them, and called me the axeman to drive the stakes, and that's on the second 10 miles of the road. Now that was before 1900, but in 1967. About 1907, I guess.
1897 or 1907?
1897, I mean.
I understood that they had a big fire here, or a fire here in Sapulpa before 1900. Do you recall that?
Well, there just wasn't much of anything big to burn, but the only fire I remember about that time was a store, and I was just trying to think of that fellow's name that had that store. It burned down that is on Dewey Avenue in the unit block. And I can't think of the man that owned that store. That's the biggest fire I can remember anything about, and that was one awful cold night, and they had a fire department, but it wasn't very much, but they threw that fire up there, and it was so cold that the water would freeze before it would ever fall.
I understood they had a celebration here about the time that Sapulpa was incorporated. Do you recall that celebration?
No, somebody's talking to me about that a while ago, and I can't remember that. Possibly here, and sometimes now, I was took away sometimes, sent away to do some work, but I still held my home here, you know. Like I went out to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and hung the doors in the governor's palace out there. Architect sent me out there to hang those doors. It might have been in that. I don't remember what year that was, whatever year that governor's home was built.
Do you recall any particular celebrations or festivals that they had here in the early days that you particularly remember?
Oh, I don't remember anything, only just the 4th of July celebration. We had about 1909, they had a big prize fight here, if that'd be interesting to you. Carl Morris and Mike Schreck, and it was held out close to the moccasin tracks here. And that was the biggest thing we had here in a long time, you know. You're just such a mob, you couldn't hardly get around there at all. I was undersheriff at that time.
You were undersheriff how many years?
Well, that'll come down into months, about 3 or 4 months.
Can you tell about any of your experiences while you were undersheriff?
Well, when John, well, I'm not going to mention any names, but whoever was sheriff then wanted me as undersheriff, and I told him, I said, I don't know anything about the sheriff business. Well, he said, you can learn, and I told him, well, I said, there's one thing about it. I said, if I go into sheriff's office, I'm going to stop this bootlegging. Well, he said, that's just the reason I want you, so I thought you'd do it. So I went around to the bootleggers and all that I knew of them and told them. I said, I'm going to give you 30 days to clean up. And I said, after that, you get ready, that'll be your own fault. Some of them cleaned up and some of them didn't. But I went to raiding, and I just about had it dry, and the sheriff called me in there one day, and he said, if this raiding ain't stopped, he said, somebody's going to lose their job. Well, I said, that couldn't be anybody but me. But I said, I just now started. And I went along till I lost my job.
How about some of your experiences with the Indians?
Well, I never had a whole lot of experience with the Indians. She's speaking about Woosey Deer. Woosey Deer, when it come into a lot of money, oil money, and she was an awful nice-looking Indian girl, but she got to drinking. And I don't know how many times she was married, but several times. And finally, I think she just got in the car and drove into a bridge out here and killed herself. Somebody driving with her or not, I don't know. That's just all to say with me. And now, shut that up just a minute. Who was that other Indian girl? I can't remember her. She was talking about.
Give the name.
Wassy Guinea Pig. She was one of the girls, well, she wasn't much of a girl either. She got to be a woman, but she'd come up here, and every time she'd get drunk, she'd just take her out and lay her in a wagon and take her home when they went home. And that's about all there was about Osie, only she's a Wassy, but she was drunk every time she come to town. And just nothing bad. I got so they didn't arrest her at all. They take care of her. That's about all his experience imposed.
You understood you used to live in a sod house. A sod house. Could you describe this and when?
Yes. Well, when I built that on that lease that I told you about when I was talking here, we built that that must have been that was in 96.
1896.
1896.
Where did you build it?
It was about 4.5 miles southwest of Mounds. And that was built it's about 20 feet wide and about 40 feet long. And we went out and plowed the sod, and of course we built them in Kansas, and I knew we had know how to build them. This uncle of mine knew all about how to build them. We plowed the sod, and we laid that up. And they come up Sapulpa, then they had put in a little sawmill there. And we got our lumber, native lumber, and made our frames and everything out of that. And we made 2 rooms out of that, and then we plastered it, put a fireplace at one end of it. We plastered with, on the inside, right on the sod, with lime and sand. And the outside, we trimmed the outside we made it 3 feet at the bottom and then made it 2 feet wide at the top. And we trimmed that off so it sloped back about a foot. We never did anything else to the outside. We put a nice big porch on the one side of it, and that was the side house. And I was married in that side house in 1800.
Let's.
Oh, Lord, I'll give it. Did I give that to you? I didn't invent it. I just made it.
Let's talk about the cabinet making in this period.
Well, I guess I made about the first built-in cabinet that was built in Sapulpa. And I just, I don't know, I just had all I could do here for about 20 years. That's about all I did was built-in cabinets, and I'd done some work for the oil fields, cut out the wheels and something like that on a bandsaw. That's just about all I did. I don't know the cabinets that I couldn't hardly guess the number I did build.
Can you recall the first oil discoveries? Tell a little about them.
Well, I don't really know any facts about it. Of course, it's on the Glen Pool is where the first oil was started. And right after it was started, I went out there one day, took my family out there. They were going to bring a well in, and we went out to see it. And we did. And that thing, I never saw one come in. They come in when they had put the shot in just before we got there. And I'd just begin to throw the oil out. They come up just like a pulsar beating. They'd come a little higher, So it got up clear up the top of the derrick, and then it did die down the same way. Now that's about all I know about the oil field, except that the Glen Pool was a big spot here in the oil business.
Tell about what happened in the town and in the area when the Glen Pool came in.
Well, you couldn't. We'd all had board sidewalks and no paved streets or anything of the kind. And the sidewalks are not very wide, and you just had elbow your room where any place you went. And the depot over there, the Harvey House, you could hardly walk on the platform. So many people there. They were just, I don't know, just everything was a movement. You never saw the like of people in your life. There wasn't no much space, for to be in. The town was small. And I got no idea how many people there was, but they were just all kinds of people, and there's lots of them.
Any other memories that you have regarding the oil discovery?
No, nothing particular. It just happened every day, And the big tanks, of course, had lots of big oil fires. It used to be these tanks, I think, hold 55,000 barrels, and the lightning would strike them. And we'd have some awful fires. That smoke would, go way up in the air, and then this blaze would follow that gas up in the air, and made an awful pretty sight after night. But they finally got that. We don't have them anymore. I don't know what they did, but they got that stopped somewhere.
That's good. Tell us about the outlaws now.
Al and Frank Jennings, Pat and Morris O'Malley, and Dick West was the Jennings gang. It's all that I knew of them, the 5 of them. I knew Al Jennings and Frank in western Kansas when we lived out there. I knew his father. His father, they called him Doc. He never practiced, but I don't know whether he was a doctor or whether he wasn't. They would come by our place there, and he was a well-educated man. Al was he was the foreman of it, the head of it. He was a well-educated man, one of the nicest men you ever talked to. And, they'd come there maybe once a year or something like that. Finally, they captured him down here down Duck Creek, somewhere down there, down a place down there. One of them got sick one time, and we put him up in our attic till he got well, so the officers wouldn't find him. However, Heck Thomas and Bill Tillman were the big officers in them days through this country. They never did stop at our place. We've seen them around there, spying on the house every time, but they never did come down. And I took Frank one time. I took him over to the Wills Ranch, showed him where that was. He didn't know how to get to where his brother was. I took him over where he could see the Wills Ranch one night, and that's about all the experience I have with the Jennings boys. Oh, they did take a horse one time, but then they just had to do that to send word to. I never got the horse back. They told me he was going to take it. He did. Offered to pay for it. I wouldn't let him do it. I told him to bring it back, but they never got it back. And Bill Doolin come there one time to get his breakfast. Wanted to get the breakfast, he and another man, 2 other men. And we were making hay. That was in that must have been about 1896. And my uncle told me, he said, we just imagined that if you can cook your own breakfast, why you can have breakfast all you want of it. So they said they could cook. They told him that they had just broke jail over in Gussie, and it comes through here, and when he went after a bucket of water down to the spring, why, they had our guns. They had a rifle and a shotgun. And they told him that they'd send them guns back if they weren't captured, but they was captured in a little while after that when we never got the guns back. Then the other outlaws was, the Buck Gang. You've heard of the Buck Gang, have you? Well, I had a wonderful little horse, a little saddle horse. It's one of the best little horses around. They got a hold of it, and they wanted him. So they come one night, and they had him in two workhorses driving him down, I suppose, to get him in a place where they could catch him. And Gus Chambers was staying there, helped us put up hay. And he had an big old stag hound, and he barked and made a big noise, and they went to the door, and he seen him driving the horse, and he hollered at him to halt, and they just commenced shooting. And they shot, I don't know how many shots there. Some of the neighbors said 150, but I don't think there's that many, but an awful lot of them. Boy, I was in a tent, and we had just had the sun house wasn't built then. It was the same place. But the boy in the tent there, one of the bullets, we crawled down low, and they kind of sort like this, you see. And we got down on the ground so it would shoot over us if we could. But they struck him in the foot, just in the leg, just a little, burned him just a little. I don't know how many, several bullets went through the tent, and a lot of them in the logs on the house. But this old pony was afraid that they would, whenever he shot a gun, he just scared him to death, you know. And he run, but the other horses didn't, and they caught one of the other horses and rode him off. He got down about 4 or 5 miles south, they found another horse down there. They turned my horse loose and got the other horse. They come, that neighbors did, the next day, and the light horse come up there too. The light horse was the police that the Indians had in them days, you know. They took their trail, and they trailed them off down in there, I don't know how far, to a little store that they'd robbed, and they went off and went to sleep. And these light horse run on to them, and they caught 4 of them. But the other got away. If he wasn't with them or something, anyhow, they only got 4 of them. They took them to Fort Smith. Judge Parker hung them. They raped one married woman there, and they said some girl. But I didn't know that's just hearsay with me about that, you know. But that's all. They finally caught the other Indian, though, and I guess they hung him. I don't know whether they hung him or not, but they did hang him with a 4. Now, that's about all my outlaw experience.
Thank you very much, Mr. Guy Hereford, who came to Sapulpa, Oklahoma in March 1895 and who has been a builder here for many, many years. This is Penn Woods. I'm interviewing for the Oklahoma Living Legends. I'm visiting in Sapulpa, Oklahoma on December 4th with Mr. J. Bryce Hickey, retired farmer from the Sapulpa area who came to Sapulpa area in 1900 at the age of 2 and who has lived in this area ever since. Mr. Hickey, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your birth and early parentage and early background before coming here.
No, I really don't, because I wasn't old enough to remember then. I really don't remember about...
I just wanted the names of your parents, where you were born and such.
I was born in Jasper County, Missouri, the son of William B. Hickey and Ida Spence Hickey. We came to Sapulpa in December 1900. We came on the Frisco Railroad, which was fairly new then, and all of the processions was in this boxcar, including everything that we owned: a team of horses, cow, chickens, feed, farm implements, household goods. All of the processions was in this boxcar. Go ahead.
Could you describe the town of Sapulpa when you came here?
Not really right then, but a few years later, I remember it very well. Most of the buildings were either frame buildings or tents. The common practice then of living was a tent with a native wood floor and about 3 boards high around the outside, and then the tent was fastened on it, and that was one-room living quarters. It was mostly remnants of the workers that put the railroad through here earlier. They had most of them, not most of them, but some of them had stayed here when the railroad went on. There was no, as I remember, and up until maybe 1904 or 5, there was no masonry buildings at all in Sapulpa. There was either all frame or tents.
Now you lived on a farm when you came here. Is that correct? Where were you located?
Located 7 miles northwest of Sapulpa, the area where the Lake Stahoma is now. We first bought out an Indian lease that was good for 4 years. We lived on it from 1901 to 1905, and then we rented from an Indian by the name of Joseph Bruner, well-known Indian interpreter for the Creek and Yuchi tribe here in Sapulpa.
Could you describe the farm of those days?
Well, yes, it was mostly all new land. It was fairly new at that time. Of course, it was all horsepower. There were no mechanical farming in them days, and it was most all of the subsistence of the people was derived from the farm. They bought very little things in them days. Everything was prepared and raised on the farm.
Could you describe the work on the farm? Describe a farm day during the early period.
Well, it began fairly early, about daylight, and lasted as long as you could go. It just consisted of doing the chores of feeding the horses and cows and hogs and getting ready to go to work. And you got out to the field about daylight as soon as you could see, especially shucking corn. I went out with my father many a day to shuck corn and have to wait a few minutes till it got light enough to see how to shuck corn. It was a long, drawn-out procedure to farm in those days. Consisted of 14, 16, 18 hours a day. And the income was not in proportion to the hours you put in.
How much land was your family able to farm with the equipment that you had at that time?
Well, the farm that we lived on so long there, Mr. Bruner's farm, had about 100 acres in cultivation. And with one hard hand, which we kept most all the year round, was able to cultivate 100 acres. That'd be 2 teams. It kept you busy, but it could be done.
What were you raising?
Mostly corn and cotton. Cotton was the main cash crop, and corn, of course, was a feed crop. There was some small grain, oats was raised, but not much, and then the vegetables, homegrown vegetables.
Tell about your shipping and marketing procedure.
Well, it wasn't too good. Of course, there wasn't too much surplus grain grown here at that time. The cotton market was good because it was resources to take care of the cotton. But the main corn market, the area where they disposed of the surplus corn, was at a place called Fisher, about 10 miles southwest of Sand Springs, called Fisher Switch. That's where the cattlemen from Texas unloaded their cattle and drove them into the Osage. And the farmers would haul their surplus corn there to feed those steers when they came back from the pasture before they put them on the market. And I have seen stacks of corn there as high as you could scoop it out of a wagon, a half a mile long, just piled out there on the ground. And most of that prices of corn was at that time was from 11 to 14 cents a bushel. In other words, you grew that corn and hauled it from anywhere from 10 to 20 miles and put it out there and sold it for 14 cents a bushel.
How about your own farm subsistence? How much of your own subsistence did you care for on your farm?
Well, practically everything, but the staple articles that wasn't grown here, of course, we didn't raise sugar, we didn't raise coffee, but all of the meat, practically all of the meat, was grown either domestic or wild. The vegetables that could be were canned, dried, preserved, however they could be kept. The lard was put up enough lard to do you all year, put up enough pork. Beef couldn't be kept that long, but you could kill a beef most any time of the year. Wild game, turkeys, and deer were plentiful.
Describe your farmhouse at that period.
The first one we lived in was a dugout called a cement dugout. It wasn't all in the ground, it wasn't all above. It was about 4 feet deep in the ground and 3 large logs around the outside, a fireplace in the back of it, one window in the south and a door in the end. And the floor was wood, and the floor was dirt floor, and the walls were dirt up until to the top of the ground. And the way got wood into this fireplace was in the back end of the dugout, and the door was in the front end. And I've often seen my father drag a large log with a horse in the front door and back to the fireplace to roll it on the fireplace, and it would burn for a week or so. Big log, 14, 18 inches in diameter and about 6 foot long. And that's the way we got the wood into the fireplace.
Can you think of any particular experiences on the farm that you feel might be of interest?
Well, we had our grouse. That was one year I remember was extremely cold winter. I think that was in the winter of 5 and 6 probably. There was a sleet fell on snow and froze. It was about the thickness, about 6-inch thickness, and it was very destructive to livestock, and especially wild stock. That was really the beginning of the deer decline in this area. The deer were slaughtered by the hunters because they couldn't travel a slick surface. And there was a story of one man that killed some 40-some deer in one canyon with a broomstick. In other words, he got them down in this canyon, they couldn't get out, all he had to do was just hit him in the head with his broomstick, 40 of them. That was the winter, I believe, of 4 and 5, or 5 and 6, I've forgotten.
Tell about some of the worst periods from the standpoint of either drought or other problems.
Well, the drought came on later, of course, up in the 35 and 34 and 35 was the real, but that was farther on back. We had, and of course, then we had the boll weevil put the cotton production out of business there for a few years, but that was later on too. I don't recall of anything other than just some years were exceptionally wet, which was bad, and some were exceptionally dry, was bad.
I realize that working the number of hours that you did, that there wasn't much time for recreation, but tell us about what recreation you did have in the farm during this period.
Well, mostly it was square dancing and baseball. And after statehood, when they got, when the school buildings were built around in the districts, they had a central meeting place. There was entertainment there, church services, and of course, Christmas celebrations and one thing and another. But the main entertainment, as I remember back in them days, was square dancing and baseball.
Although you lived on the farm, I'm sure you were conscious of not only what was happening in Sapulpa, but probably on certain big occasions made trips into Sapulpa to take part in celebrations. Can you tell about some of the events in Sapulpa that you can think of that are particularly memorable, and maybe describe them?
Yes, I remember the one out at the moccasin tracks that Mr. Herford spoke of. I remember that celebration very well. It was the 4th of July. I don't recall the year, but it was there that I saw my first balloon. The first balloon that I've ever seen, and I guess the first one in this area had a dissension there where the man went up in the balloon and fell out with a parachute. Very, very spectacular them days.
Can you think of any other particular celebrations?
Well, they had rodeos quite a bit. It was a field, rodeo arena, or it was used for various things in the southwest part of town. And I remember going there on several 4th of Julys and probably other times when they had rodeos similar to the ones they hold now, very similar.
Was the rodeo circuit a national circuit as it is today, or was it mainly Oklahomans or the people in the area?
I don't think there was any organization at that time. I'm sure there wasn't, and these rodeos over here were just strictly local. They were not associated with anybody else, I'm sure.
Can you tell us about some of the people who have played a part either in the growth of the Sapulpa area or the rural area that are memorable to you, you feel should be remembered?
Well, Mr. Bruner, who was our landlord for about 30 years, was very instrumental in the development, I think, of Sapulpa. He was a full-blood Creek Indian, but he spoke English very well, and he was well educated. He wasn't an attorney, but he was accepted as a least man, just as commended as any attorney in the area. He was an interpreter for the Creek Nations, and he had done a lot, I think, to help develop the country. He was, at one time, he was supposed to have been the guardian for 7 millionaire Indians that had become millionaires through oil, and he represented 7 of them who was in the millionaire class at one time.
What were the early industries, very early industries of Sapulpa that you recall?
Oh, the brick, I guess, probably was one of the earliest ones. There was a glass plant here, too, called the Sapulpa Sunflower Glass Company. Was here, came here in about 1913. It lasted some 8 or 10 years, I guess. It was right west of town where the brick plant is now.
Did you ever visit that plant?
Yes, I did.
Tell us about its operation.
Well, it was very crude compared to the methods they use now. They made strictly plate glass there, and it was what they call hand-blown glass. It was very new. I remember quite well that every chance I got, I'd go there to watch those blowers blow those big globes. They blowed them out in big globes about 5 foot long and about 2.5 or 3 feet in diameter. One man handled that on a hollow tube. And you blow that tube out and hang it down there and cool it. And then the ends, each end was cut off to make an endless, bottomless and topless tube. Then it was split down the middle and put in a furnace and flattened out. And that made it into plate glass. And that was all that plant made. All they ever made, as far as I know. They never did make anything else but just plate glass.
All right. Could you tell us about this story?
This was about the 2nd or 3rd year we lived here in the Indian Territory, and one evening, about between sundown and dark, an Indian came to our house, elderly Indian. He was a neighbor. We knew him well. He was well-educated Indian, but for some particular reason, he never did learn how to speak English. He was a adept person with sign language, but he couldn't speak a word of English. So we were eating supper, and he called my father outside, and he made some motions that he wanted my father to go with him. And he had a big, long, muzzle-loading rifle with him, and my mother didn't think that was a good idea. She didn't want him to go with him at all, so the Indian quickly found out what the trouble was, so he took his rifle over and set it up against a tree and held up his hands and said, "Come on, let's go," in sign language. So my father got his pony and they rode off together. And about an hour or so they came back and they had the biggest buck deer that you ever seen on this Indian's pony. And the trouble was that he had killed this big deer and he couldn't get it on his pony, and he wanted somebody to help him load his deer. So he took it on home and he left his rifle. So the next day about 10 or 11 o'clock he came back with a quarter of venison and got his rifle and went on his way. That Indian's name was Eufaula.
Can you think of anything else that might be of interest? Okay. We have just been visiting with Mr. J. Bryce Hickey, who came to Sapulpa in 1900. This is Penn Woods recording for the Oklahoma Living Legends. I'm visiting on December 4th, 1969 with Marshall McCombs, who was born in Sapulpa in 1920, who's the grandson of James Sapulpa and the great-grandson of Chief Sapulpa. Mr. McCombs, I wonder if you can tell us from your background, could you tell us a little bit, as you have had it passed to you from your family, about Chief Sapulpa and about his background?
Chief Sapulpa was of the lower creeks in Alabama, and upon the signing of the treaty for the removal of the creeks from Alabama, he was very dissatisfied. He was an independent gentleman. He was well educated. He had a knowledge of the white man's language. He was well acquainted with many of the merchants of the southern Alabama area. So as a result, he was well traveled. And upon the signing of the treaty, he decided that perhaps he might go down into Florida with the Seminoles. There was some doubt in his mind as to the authenticity of this treaty and what it meant to his people. Finally, Chief Sapulpa made his way to Charleston, South Carolina. And at Charleston, with the aid of several of his friends, he boarded a ship and went around to New Orleans. By that time, he had made up his mind that he was going to come to Oklahoma and see for himself what kind of territory had been allocated to the Creeks for their new home. From New Orleans, he traveled up the Mississippi to the Arkansas, and then came up the Arkansas to where Fort Smith is at the present time, and then came cross country to the location of what is now the city of Sapulpa. Upon arriving here, he found that the country was to a certain extent about the same as it had been in Alabama. The tribe in the meantime had been moving. Several thousand of them had been moved into the southern part of what is now the Creek Nation. And rather than go all the way back to Alabama and maybe going down into Florida with the Seminoles, he resolved himself that his need perhaps was with his people. So he decided that he would remain here in the area of what is now Sapulpa. Chief Sapulpa, being a fairly educated man and having been friends with many merchants, decided that perhaps the best thing for him to do would be to open a merchandise store in this area. He built his home in an area which is located in the southeast section of what is now Sapulpa. And at this home, he began to run a trading store. Previous to the Civil War, it was necessary for him to go by wagon from this area all the way to Fort Smith, where that he bought his goods, loaded them in his wagons, and then brought them back here to Sapulpa. After the Civil War, he began to make his buying trips then to Coffeyville, Kansas. For some time, there was only his store here, one or two other homes which belonged to the family, and at one time a blacksmith came in and settled perhaps in the neighborhood of around 5 blocks from his place and set up a blacksmith shop. We were on the trail in this area of many of the cattle drives which were coming up from Texas. We were on the trail of the stagecoach line which ran from Veneta on down into the Sac and Fox Reservation, and somewhere it joined with the California trails. So there was an outlet here. The railroads were coming in, and the old man figured that he had picked a good location. After the Civil War, of course, and a little previous to that, the city of Sapulpa began to grow up. Now, when Chief first settled here, he claimed in his original claim 10 miles in each direction from his house, 10 miles south, 10 miles north, 10 miles east, and 10 miles west. In other words, he had a 20 square mile area which was known as the Chief Sapulpa Ranch, and this is where he ran his cattle and his sheep, and in many instances drove his own stock and everything to the railhead for shipment back to Kansas City and then to the eastern and northern markets. He was married 3 times, and of the 3 times he had 10 children. One of the daughters of the second marriage was Yarna, and Yarna, of course, was my grandmother. She married Marshall McCombs, and they then settled, went back into Eufaula because the McCombs came from the Eufaula area. They went back there and settled, and of this union there were 2 children born. There was my father, who was Joseph, and then an aunt who died at an early age. She was about 8 years old when she died. After about the same time, I believe it might have been the flu, took my grandmother and my grandfather, and my dad then came to Sapulpa and lived with James, who was a son of the first marriage of the chief. So it was as progress began to come into the country. Of course, in 1905, the Creek Nation was broken up. Each Indian in the nation was given an allotment number. They were given an allotment of 160 acres, and this, of course, broke up the old chief's ranch. My family at that time, my grandfather, my grandmother, my dad, and a daughter of James Sapulpa by a previous marriage at that time got their allotment and controlled in the southeast section of Sapulpa about 720 acres. Of this allotment now, we have 20 acres left of the original allotment, which is still in the hands of the family. And after my father came here, he grew up here with my grandfather, James. He was legally adopted. Even though he was a blood relative, he was legally adopted primarily for legal reasons as the son of James and Lizzie Sapulpa. And it was in their home on the southwest section of town, a great big 3-story, 13-room house, that I was born July the 30th of 1920. My life has been primarily at that time that of a farm boy. I grew up in the home. English was not very well spoken. In fact, I did not speak English until I began going to school when I entered the first grade when I was 5 years old, and up until that time, the Creek language was the principal language that I spoke. Principally, there was a reason for it. James Sapulpa, of course, did not have a formal education. although he had lived with the around the white people all of his life, he spoke the language fluently. And at one time, as my grandmother told me, James was downtown. He was talking to some of the white people down there, and he made mistakes with his grammar. And as a result, they laughed at him. They made him so mad, and he did have a temper, that he swore right then and there that he would never speak the white man's language again, and he didn't until the very day that he died. So as a result, even though James thoroughly understood the white man, there were many times when we would have to go to court dealing with the oil company's pollution of water and things of that nature. James would not speak in the white man's language. It was my privilege at that time as a young boy, up until when I was 11 years old when he died. There were many times that I had the privilege of accompanying him on his legal episodes, you might call it, and I acted as his interpreter. Well, since my mother was a white woman, my color, of course, blends with that of the regular Caucasian. My Indian name was Pijahutki, or Pijahutkoji. That meant little white grandfather, and this name was given to me by the Indians of the tribe because the many, many times which I accompanied my grandfather and acted as his interpreter. Even though my father went along with us and he spoke the language the same as I did, and my grandmother sometimes would be along, he always wanted me to act as his interpreter, and I did so up until the time that he died in 1931.
Can you tell us a little bit about Chief Sapulpa both as you have read and as you have heard through your family, a little bit about his tribal relations and his work as the chief?
Chief Sapulpa, in reality, once he got here from Alabama and began to settle down, he wanted to have his tribe progress the same as what he had seen the white man do. He realized, he was one of the few, I believe, at that time that realized that the life of the Indian laid in progressing along the same lines as the white man, that there was a reason for education, and that there was a reason that once an Indian was educated, that he could go into the various professions and the various businesses, and that he could make a better life for himself than just out here on the farms, hacking it out, as we say, on the ground behind a mule somewhere. That was his desire, and that was his wish. He devoted his lifetime to that purpose, trying to get the young Indians of those days to go away and get an education, to come back and enter into the professions if they would. He became very religious. He joined the church somewhere around the 1870s, right after the Civil War. He finally, for the first time, joined the church. And he became a very religious man, and he worked primarily also in the religious field because he believed that there was something there. We do know that there was a period of time here, probably perhaps through his efforts, back in the days when I was just a young fella, that you could walk down the streets of Sapulpa here and talk to many of the young boys and young girls of my father's generation, and you would find that the majority of them either had a college education or they had at least 2 or 3 years of college if they hadn't finished. And I'm sure that this was through the efforts of my our great-grandfather James, or Chief.
Could you tell a little about the political relations with the white man, with Chief Sapulpa?
Chief Sapulpa was more or less a Democrat. His party would have been that of the Democrat today. The Civil War hit him very hard. Of course, he was a slave owner. And though the slaves were more or less enjoyed freedom on his ranch, he wanted them to have the right to say so themselves, whether they wanted to leave or not. And right after the Civil War, of course, when they were made to leave, whether they wanted to or not, this ironed the old man quite hard. He spoke out many, many times about this. He spoke out against the government about this. He was never satisfied with the treaty which the Creeks had presented to them right after the Civil War. Otherwise, basically, he was a great believer in law and order. He, being a member of the Creek Council at that time had a government which was similar to that we have in the United States today. It was a democratic form of government, where that each township elected their own representative to represent them in the tribal council. They had their own police force, the Creek Light Horsemen. They carried out their own law and order. He was a great believer in these things. And I would say that principally, if we had to classify him, he would have been a builder more than anything else.
Can you think of any other sidelines to Chief Sapulpa, or possibly any of the stories or anecdotes, true stories or anecdotes related to him?
No, not offhand. Many of the stories that were told to me by my grandmother and my grandfather about the old man are more or less, well, they're not personal, but I've forgotten many of the episodes that go on. As I say, of course, the old man had been dead a number of years after I was born. And I remember more of what went on within James's home than I did about the chief.
Could you tell some about his home and about other than what you've told?
Well, James was a rancher. At the time that I grew up, James was a rancher. We ran cattle, we farmed cotton, we farmed grain. In the household at that time, we still had two of the former slaves of the chief. We had a fellow by the name of Taylor and his wife Annie. They had been just young children when the Civil War ended, and they were freed, and rather than leave, they chose to remain. And Annie Taylor, more or less, was what we call the old Negro mammy, and she's the one that really took care of me and raised me. But ours was strictly a ranch and a farm, and that's the home that the home life that we occupied. I was the only child out there, outside of my aunt, who was also an adopted daughter of James and Elizabeth. Although she was several years older than I was, between the two of us, we were the only children that ever grew up on the ranch out there.
Chief?
We have...
See, since you didn't know the chief, I call him chief.
Yeah, we have just been visiting with Marshall McCombs of Sapulpa, a native of Sapulpa, the grandson of James Sapulpa, and the great-grandson of Chief Sapulpa. This is Penn Woods. The date is December 4th, 1969. We are in Sapulpa at this time.